Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to ASA, to the president, and to the chairman for inviting me here today. And thank you to Ajahn Bunsarm as well for sharing the stage with me here. It's a true pleasure to be here in Thailand, which is a second home to me. The title of the presentation today is Culture, and I will be looking at how I address that in my personal work, in my collaborations, and in my practice. To start off, to give you an introduction, I'm an architect from Bahrain, and I work across many disciplines, including exhibition, curation, but also architectural design and research. Maraj is the name of my practice, and I'll be sharing some of the work from that practice, but also other work that expands beyond that in terms of research and collaboration. When looking at the idea of culture, I study it through climate, through ecology, materials, history, but also storytelling and sharing across time, but more importantly, with people. My encounter with Ajahn Bunsarm was really purely by chance. I've always been familiar with his work, but also inspired by the type of work that he does. And one thing led to the other, from coming across his work to meeting him in the US while I was undergoing my graduate studies and teaching. That led us to the point of continued meetings and eventually collaboration. I wanted to share a page from my graduate thesis document where I categorized the type of architects that really influenced my work and the ones that really I aspired towards. And I've put them in categories like funicular geometricians or formalists or material manipulators, but lastly, craftful and culturally conscious. And Ajahn Bunsarm sits in that list for me at the top left corner for the type of work that he does beyond the form, the material, but also the culture and the communities that he touches. As well, Anne Holtrop, who will be speaking next, is listed there. And I call them process daredevils because they're not scared to test what's not been tested. I'm sharing a map here just to give a bit of a geography lesson from where I am and where I'm from and where we are today. It's also because I feel like the Gulf region, which is where most of the work I do is centered from, or the work that I'll be sharing today is based from, is an unfamiliar geography. So I'm pulling out a few more images from my thesis document that explain that geography. This one here is sharing where the cement trade routes between the Gulf countries and the rest of the world are. Between 2000 and 2020, the lighter colors are 2000, the darker is 2020. And that circle has decreased more and more as material dependency has increased. But I share this map because it's connecting our geographies, but then zooming in closer, I think this place, over the last month, has maybe become more familiar to the world than it has been historically because of how that little point there has stopped the world so much and transformed the world so much and will continue to transform it in the coming year as the impact of the last month will unfold. The map here actually shows you in very light gray, the dots are the oil field, and in crosses, the cement plants, and in stars, the limestone quarries and crushers. And this is just some background research that I've done before pursuing my thesis work that I'll share at the end of the presentation today. But I deliberately share this map early because I think it's important to be familiar with it. I come from Bahrain, which is this tiny dot there. But it's at a geography that has historically been a point of trade and a point of very rich cultural exchange, which makes its position powerful there in the Gulf. So I'll start with culture as something climatic as something climatic, and then ecological, and then as material. And the projects I'm sharing today are deliberately not necessarily built architectural works. Sometimes they're research endeavors that are the beginning of something else that will probably unfold in the future. But I find what is inspiring about Ajahn Bunsam's work is that there is a very strong foundation in research before proposing anything that is at the scale of a building or architecture. So first, I'll be observing, reflecting, writing, and sharing a story and questions to then answer in the future. So starting with culture as climatic, I'm sharing Sweating Assets, which was the Bahrain Pavilion in the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2023, which looks at the question of culture and climate and how historically our relationship with thermal comfort has transformed and changed with the introduction of technologies. The pavilion looked at the question of an arid landscape and a humid atmosphere, and how these two things are connected by the air conditioner unit. I think it's a familiar thing when we've experienced the drop of water coming from the AC unit, but with such a humid atmosphere that we have and a hot climate where water is so scarce, we thought, what does it mean to quantify all that amount of condensate that emerges from air conditioning units? So the pavilion was essentially a large vitrine that was condensing water as it was cooled, which was a metaphor for the buildings that we occupy. And then the drops of water were very carefully diverted into a landscape, which is what we propose to happen. And this is important. This is not such an issue here, but somewhere where rainfall is scarce, it's important to collect every drop. And this is what we are really alluding to in terms of policy change. And in the Gulf, water has played a huge role in providing comfort and bringing people together. Historically, the springs in Bahrain and the wider region have been a gathering point for comfort. I'll read this excerpt from the book that we produced for the pavilion. Water is an agent that has long played a role in dictating comfort levels in the Arabian Gulf, but it's a double agent, sometimes causing agitations in forms of humidity, and other times it is a refuge. Once, it was a familiar scene to witness men floating in and around Adari, their bodies immersed in the infamous spring, a sanctuary amidst the heat. Coping was collective and water was the medium. Yet thermal delight was not necessarily the only comfort attained here. Social relationships blossomed as individual bodies flushed heat into the larger hydrous body. Adari was a natural phenomenon that manifested into a social one. A space for gathering and indulgence, the spring and its peripheries hosted recreation, congregation, and prayer. This is an image of a drawing that we propose for a future where the reserves from condensation get fed into springs, which are now dry and have become depleted landscapes. These are important landscapes because they host natural life around them that mitigates larger issues that we are now facing today because they are depleted. And we've quantified everything so that we know the numbers and volumes, and also have done so in comparison with the date fruit and its water demand across the year. And we've correlated that with the amount of condensate supply from the AC units and how the date with time grows in moisture. So around August, when it's the highest heat and the largest demand of air conditioning, is when you also have the largest moisture content in the date. So there's a correlation there that can be studied further and applied. Moving on to culture as ecological, which is linked to climate as well. I'm talking about Maghras, a farm for experimentation in ASA in Saudi Arabia, which actually shares the same aquifer of water that the springs in Bahrain were fed from. That work collated was done for a Saudi pavilion in the Triennale Milano last year, and got put together into the book A Maghras Farm for Experimentation, which I was one of the editors for. The image on the very left there shows you historically what the springs looked like in Al-Ahsa. Again, it's the same water, and it connected the people of Bahrain to Saudi, although it was through very underground networks that are not visible until the spring pops up. And these images show you some of the spaces of Al-Ahsa, and what I found interesting is how even somewhere like in Ahsa, which is the largest date palm grove in the world, the oasis is constantly evolving, and you're now finding, for example, farmers experimenting with growing Thai papaya trees in the farms there. Much like how in Thailand there's experimentation with growing Saudi date palms as well, and how the popularity of the fruits across the regions are shifting. Of course, this raises larger questions about the ground and the soil and the response to that, but I think culturally speaking, this really says something about the people of the place and their natural interests across time. The research from Maghras was, at least for my part, collated into programming and bringing people together onto this farm, which is a space that's changing, and with the growth of urbanization, the farm spaces are reducing more and more. And so we looked at ways of documenting a lot of the histories. For example, the rice farmers here, the drawings on the left share where the rice farms are and how they're reducing in size, or they're being pushed out because of water depletion. And over here, the channels are drying out, and less of the water reserves are dedicated to the rice farming. And then the research as well looked at the relationship between the farm. Over here, you see the burning of date palm byproduct to protect the farm by creating natural pesticides in the area, and how that links to the village, and how the relationship between these two places are intertwined between the grove and the places where people lived. But also linking it back to the city, the bigger cities to the north now, El Khobar, which is where the water comes from now. Historically, it came from natural springs, but now it's coming from a sewage effluent. So the oasis is relying on larger cities to supply its survival. And then zooming out even more is just a map to show you the link between Al-Ahsa and Bahrain over there, and how this underground network is really connecting them. The work also included a lot of programming, whether it's with artists, poets, craftspeople, looking especially at things that are at the brink of dying out, especially as crafts. This is the last practicing craftsperson who does this rush mat weaving using a plant specific to the area. And so we invited him in to teach mostly women who were interested in continuing the craft, and then drew out these illustrations to share and record that history, but also include the poetry that reflects that centuries ago this plant was known and was commonly used, and it can't end now. So what are we doing to stop that? And then moving on to another ecological site that we did work for as Maraj is Stories of the Island Inlet, which is speaking the story of Nabi Saleh, an island in Bahrain. The project uses embroidery and tapestry to record a history of a place that we only really know through storytelling and oral histories of how there are folk tales around it about how when you take from this island and leave, often you're met with misfortune, like your boat sinking. And so it tells you a lesson of ecology and sustainability. And we thought that due to land reclamation and changing ecological conditions, it's important to actually record what's around. And rather than recording it in conventional formats, we use the tapestry to create all of the ornamentation. So I've deliberately not shown any images of the island itself, but I'm showing you my translation or our translation of what that looked like. So we studied all the species, counted them, and mapped the numbers across so that from the start to the end, some things change in numbers or change color to show their disappearance. And then all the details and ornamentation. This pavilion in Dubai Design Week addressed the idea of ornamentation, and we choose to do so using the natural environment and the habitats of migratory birds that come through the island and leave, as well as crabs and other marine life. And of course, the date palm groves that live on the island and all the surrounding species that benefit from it. The island is a transitory space. It hosts shrimps that come from across the Gulf, and as well as birds that leave to Siberia. And the space was built in a way as if it's for children, and creating like a blanket fort to experience the kind of dreamlike qualities of what this island is. And as well, we gave out storybooks for children to actually read and digest this history and pass it along. And lastly, I'll talk about culture as material, moving on to maybe slightly more architectural aspect of the work. I'll share the crown jewels, which is the thesis project that I did and is a project that I continue to work on today. It looks at how material systems have changed in the Arabian Gulf with the discovery of oil. This image is a very important one because natural pearl diving was at one point the kind of pillar of the Bahraini economy. And with the discovery of oil and the discovery of artificial pearls by the Japanese, the built landscape around the place really transformed. So what I'm proposing here is much like how pearls are sorted out by size and by quality using specific sieves and careful assortment, a demolition site that is often of modernist structures, early modernist structures of the Gulf, can be treated much like the mat that a pearl merchant would sort out his pearls on. And so larger chunks, more highly favorable chunks, smaller chunks are all separated so that they can have a better future use. And the way that I assemble these things together also takes cues from the way that the pearls are strung together or compacted together in their storage, whether it's on the left creating something from the smaller chunks like gabions, or on the right stringing it together to create a post-tensioning system where concrete, strong in compression, and carbon fiber, which is a local material from the petrochemical industry, are brought together, so compression and tension, and then strung together to create a post-tension system where rubble is treated like gem, and it's gem not because it's rare, but it's gem because of the embodied efforts, the labor, the vision that went into its creation, and destruction as well. I'll walk you through a history of construction in the Gulf, which just paints a larger picture of the region. Historically, construction homes at least, or shelters, relied on the use of palm fibers, something that looks like this, as lightweight construction. And then the more affluent would use coral stones with mangrove ties and clay to create larger shelters. And then with the growth of the oil industry, the introduction of CMU blocks and concrete increased, which is something that we're all familiar with today. And what I've proposed here is a system that is the aftermath of the modernist concrete being introduced and then demolished. And with the Gulf region, 55% of waste comes from the construction and demolition industry. So it's a really crucial and important thing to learn how to deal with that waste. And the way I've depicted this is much like the way jewelry is depicted. And so structure becomes jewelry here and takes cues from it. And there's always this back and forth to create also the sense of importance and appreciation of the materials and the landscapes that are extracted from. And it's envisioned that these systems can grow and build larger trusses to the scale of buildings. And I've developed this work during my time at MIT with really key individuals like Keith Lee, who developed this algorithm with me to create matching systems. So the rubble is scanned, and then you input the target geometry, and then it will tell you where to put what material. It will also assess, based on the specific structure, where you need larger pieces and where you need smaller pieces, and assign them based on that. And this is a little bit of what the back of that software looks like, where you have all the scans arrayed and then the target at the bottom, and then it just gets matched on to it directly. And these are some of the smaller prototypes that I've been working on to put that system in use. This is where the demolition process resulted in that sculpture on the left there. And I've tried to visualize what that would look like on a larger scale through public projects like this pier structure that utilizes the rubble on a large scale, but also the smaller scale with the compressive columns. I wanted to end by sharing a special project to us, which is a collaboration that brings me and Jan Bunsorm together. It's a proposal that we put together for the Doha Urban Space Commission, which also utilizes materials in an experimental way. We looked at the use of old oil pipes from the oil industry, which is the local vernacular, you could say, or the local material source of today, at least, and put to practice the notion of circularity and how materials from one industry that are discarded can be put to use in another industry over here. And so the main structure that you see in orange utilizes the old oil pipes, and then the round bricks that you see utilize discarded aerated cement blocks from a local factory that they can't sell to the market. So we're using it to create something else with it here with the sizes that it has. And this image just shows you the spatial quality you get under that canopy, which also addresses climate and addresses larger pragmatic uses of the space in the specific neighborhood that it's designed for. But to bring this project to life is still something that we're working on. It was meant to be built back in April, earlier this month, but that's been stalled. But to get there, what's really been enjoyable about our collaboration is the sense of humility and openness that Ajahn Bunsorm has, despite a long career and an impressive array of projects behind him. There's still room to explore and an openness to explore, especially with someone like me earlier in my career. And this image just shows the start of that and the places that we've been to, from oil pipe suppliers to smaller contractors, to start to push that project and bring it to life, which is a challenge because using unconventional materials is always a challenge that requires you to put a foot forward and convince someone to work with you on. So I'm looking forward to continuing this and sharing it more, hopefully in the future. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you for having me here.